If you look at the UN and look at it in the biggest way, the UN effectively does two things. It has two missions. One mission is the Blue Helmet peacekeeping mission, and that's what originally the UN was founded to do. Post-Second World War, that was its basic mandate. That grew as economic development took off all around the world after the Second World War, and as the gap between rich and poor began to grow around the world, the UN slowly but surely began to assume a set of goals for itself related to development, the other major mandate that the UN now has. And if you look at the UN, just about everything drops into those two categories: peacekeeping, political side of the house, and development, the economic equity side of the house. And a number of institutions were slowly but surely put together. UNICEF, reflecting the needs of children in development. UNDP, trying to develop institutional change around the world. UNFPA, look at the role of women. The human rights activities, in fact, sort of spilled over one to the other, but that began to get real headway, particularly with U.S. leadership in the 1980s, coming from this department and then the Undersecretary Warren Christopher. So all of these things began to get a certain momentum really in the 80s. It was then decided by the global community that they would have a series of international conferences to try to put a point on each or all of the major new development issues. How do we bring the world together and get the world to really understand and think about these issues? So there was a series of international conferences in the 1990s. I think the first one where Felice and I were, and the first one was the one on human rights that was in Vienna, right, Felice? That was the first in this series. In 1992 was the Earth Summit, and I'll come back to that. That was the environmental meeting. Following that was the Cairo Population Meeting in 1994. Following that was the women's meeting in Weirut in China, where Hillary made the famous speech, "Women's rights are human rights are women's rights," and really Hillary kind of burst on the international stage with that particular speech in that very kind of troubled and complicated venue in which it was given. So a number of these major conferences occurred. 1992, when the Earth Summit occurred, was at that time the largest gathering of heads of state ever to come together in the history of the world. And they all came to Rio, and people were just discovering the environment, beginning to think about this. How do you work on it? What are the issues that are involved? How does the world organize itself to begin to think about this whole new battery of issues, which for the most part, very few people in the world had thought about. And these are the last kind of things that get through finance ministries and up to heads of state. The issues that I'm talking about are the toughest ones to get through. Almost every foreign ministry, every head of state deals with the political side of the house. That's where the emphasis is. And, real men don't do environment. Real men don't do women's issues. Real men don't do human rights. We do political issues. So it was very enlightened of the UN to put together this pattern of conferences. The 1992 Rio conference came out. That was where, remember, I don't know if you remember this, there was a major controversy in the Bush administration as to whether or not George H.W. Bush was going to go or not go. Go, not go, go, not go. And Bill Clinton very cleverly grabbed that issue, and it became, amazingly enough, a major issue in that campaign. And he said, see how indecisive this administration is. Well, of course, the pressures were huge on Bush from both directions, and he eventually put together a very good delegation and did go. But it was in the lights. It was very much, people were really thinking about the environment, very much a part of the national political debate in the United States. Out of Rio in 1992 came three major documents. One of those was the climate treaty. For the first time, the world got together and said, we have got to limit, the man-made influences on the climate. We are changing the way in which the world operates, and if we do not make a change, there was no specifics on that, but it was a general statement of principles that we have to make significant changes in the way in which we are dealing with the garbage, essentially, that we're putting up in the atmosphere. The second major treaty was a biodiversity treaty, and that was we are the industrialization of the world as we see it today, and the dramatic economic growth is destroying the life support systems that make all of this possible. And we have got to limit that, and we have got to change our ways on that front, and that was the second major treaty and the major agreement of Rio. And the third was what's called Agenda 21. And some of you have had some experience with that in your communities now. Agenda 21 is, if we look ahead at what we think more ideal community ought to be, it ought to be one with lots of localism. It ought to be one in which people are thinking together about their communities. It was really a very democratic document. How do we think about doing things in a democratic fashion? How do we deal with the environment? How do we deal with all living things? How do we deal with the ocean? It was a wonderful kind of statement, and quite a long statement, about what do we think the world, how we ought to deal with the world in the 21st century, Agenda 21. So those were the three major products of Rio. And it was, I think, by anybody's accounting, a major success. It was run by a man named Maurice Strong, a Canadian who was a significant long-term leader in the UN, very close to Kofi Annan. Maurice Strong, became the major instrument for developing and pushing the Rio Conference, and out of it came those three major treaties. Well, you might say to yourself, okay, that happened at that point. What's happened since? Well, it's been on Agenda 21. There have been a series of then other major international steps, one dealing with chemicals and how chemicals are treated in the environment, one dealing with waste, how waste is dealt with, one dealing with desertification, a number of efforts to really get a handle on water, and particularly the sanitation side of water, a number of elements that were neither climate change directly nor biodiversity. A number of those steps, and those continue. There are a lot of secretariats around the world. I should have brought the list with me, but it's a very interesting development of a number of these international agreements and the world coming together. And what happens in one of these is that as the UN is so important in these, not because it's operationally running and telling people what to do, but rather it sets the norms. The countries of the world come together and say dealing with climate is important. Dealing with living things and life support systems is important. Dealing with oceans is important. Dealing with fish stocks is important. And when the UN does that, not because somebody at the top of the UN says to do it, but because the UN as a general comes to its consensus. The UN, like other organizations that are become very important, essentially operates by consensus. So the UN made these decisions. These were norms the world ought to operate, and slowly but surely we're watching the institutions of government begin to conform to Agenda 21, to the Biodiversity Treaty a little less, and then to the very, very controversial and difficult side of the Climate Treaty. And Reed's going to talk about where we are today on the climate negotiations. These are generally very hard to do. One of the most important developments, as this has been going on politically, and as environment ministries and human rights ministries and ministries are created related to women's issues, and the parts of Agenda 21 grow up and get embedded in governments, slowly but surely those governments take these on, and now we're seeing the new decade of all of this. The private sector is starting to reach in as globalization has occurred, and we've seen more and more international activities, more and more global corporations. Those institutions are beginning to understand that they also have major responsibilities. And this is, global responsibility of the corporations, called CSR. They're the responsibilities that corporations feel for themselves. So increasingly, they are getting involved, and many, many corporations now have undertaken a lot of these issues that 20 years ago, when the first of these conferences was occurring, would have been very distant from what they do. Give you an example. Some of you came to the big UNA dinner last fall in New York. And at that dinner, at the annual dinner, we always give an award to a corporation. We gave the award last year to Exxon. Not because of what Exxon's doing on energy and climate, because we sort of don't want to do that, but because Exxon had been deeply engaged in issues related to malaria and deeply engaged in issues related to empowering girls, empowering women. Very, very constructive, and really putting a lot of muscle, particularly in Africa, behind those two issues. So you want to make a point about that and the fact that they were doing it, and if Exxon can do this, others can do it as well. So there's been one of the really great changes that's occurred is the fact that the kind of public-private model has begun to take hold around the world. Final point that I will make is that this Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, has now really committed himself to engaging a lot more publics in the work of the UN, recognizing that there's no way that the UN can undertake all of the mandates that have come out of all of these conventions by itself. It's going to need as much help as possible, so deeply dependent upon non-governmental institutions historically, and now deeply independent on the private sector. So the Secretary General has announced that he wants to set up a whole new unit inside the Office of the Secretary General, really focused on public-private partnerships. This is all a new development. It's not easy to do by any means, where everybody's kind of feeling their way, but it is, you imagine, as I look at this, having been to a lot of these conferences over the year and watched the evolution, if you look at when Felice and I would have first been talking about this in Vienna 20 plus years ago, the world has, and you jump to here, it would be, whoa, that's a big change. Is it enough? Of course not. Are we getting there rapidly enough? Of course not. Are we building the perfectness? Of course not. But we hope that the trends are all in the right direction. So let me turn it over to Reed. We have organized at the UN Foundation, organized ourselves around a few very, very high priorities for us. One of those relates to energy and climate. One relates to women and reproductive health. One relates to children and vaccines in particular. And one relates to the whole advocacy area of attempting to create new voices on behalf of the UN, which is what our alliance with UNA is all about. So let me turn it over to Reed to put us into the specifics of Rio Plus 20.
Well, you can imagine having to follow that act. Did you know that Tim has a PhD in education? I think we just had a wonderful historical lecture. My other handicap is that Edison Dick came up to me and said quite clearly that he was looking forward to my words of wisdom. I said, that'll be a very short speech. So the title of this session is Energy and Climate, and Tim's given us the historical sweep, and I'm going to try to give you the snapshot today. I'm going to start with climate because Tim queued that up for me. Because really we're engaged at the UN Foundation in energy and climate because of climate. Energy is a proxy for climate. As Tim likes to say, energy is climate, climate is energy. And so we're approaching the energy topic, which I'll spend a little bit more time on, through a climate lens. And why are we doing that? Tim was a leader of the negotiating team from this building leading up to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, which set the world on a trajectory to reduce its climate emissions. 15 years later, we have to say that the Kyoto Protocol did not realize its ambitions. And In many ways, the U.S. was a case study for why that occurred. Just as in the international arena in the U.S., there was an understanding that this was a problem that needed to be tackled, needed to be taken seriously, needed strong action. But there had not been the political base built to support that action. And so when the political figures came to act on it, they didn't have the support behind them that would drive them to a conclusion. And so in Copenhagen 2 years ago, the world did not reach a definitive climate agreement. And similarly, at the same time in the U.S. Senate, the Congress was unable to agree on climate legislation. We've been looking at this problem as one that should not be addressed in that fashion, as a top-down, command and control, decide at the top what should be done and then impose it on societies. In order to build the political strength for this, we see the need for building blocks that will build the process up from the bottom. Renewable energy, energy efficiency, deforestation, all the pieces that need to be done to achieve climate emissions reductions are popular, they're doable, and they're politically saleable. If you impose the solution from the top, people get very nervous about what the economic consequences are. But if you approach it from each of these pieces, you can make progress. So we've been working for the past several years with the UN on energy, because if we can deliver reduced emissions through cleaner energy, through energy efficiency, we'll be a long way toward where we would have gone if we had approved a treaty in Copenhagen. I like to say, implement first, agree later. As it happens, that's the way the world is working anyway. As we look at the energy picture around the world, China, which has become the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, is also the larger investor in clean energy technologies. Partly that's because they're preparing for the future, but more clearly it's because it's the economically right thing for them to do, and it also cleans up the pollution that is killing their people in large numbers. So countries have motivation to address this climate problem, but they do it through an energy lens. And that brings us to the Secretary General's leadership on this topic and to Rio+20. The Secretary General spent much of his first term pushing very aggressively on climate. He really brought the world together for Copenhagen. He really tried to create a deal there. The politics were not ripe for it. It was not possible at that time. But he's also been working on the energy topic. And as I've said, these two play together. With the support of a remarkable leader of UNIDO named Kande Yumkella, who was raised in Sierra Leone, educated in the United States, taught at Michigan State, agricultural economics, went back to Sierra Leone as the Minister of Energy. And just as he had in college, occasionally in his Ministry of Energy, he had to be working by candlelight because the power would go out. So he keenly knew the effects of energy poverty, not just from the village where he grew up, but even in the capital. He went into the UN system, he became the Director General of UNIDO, and he took over the chairmanship of a coordinating group that Kofi Annan had started after the Johannesburg conference 10 years ago, called UN Energy, which brings together 20 or 22 UN agencies that all have a little bit of the energy issue. The UN doesn't have an energy agency by itself. This goes back, as my historian to my right tells me, to the reluctance of the US and the Saudis to allow that issue to be taken up in the international system. But now it is so critical to development, so critical to this other piece of the UN mission, that it has to be taken up. You cannot do development without energy, and I'm quoting Tim here, he's got all the best lines, and you can't do sustainable development without sustainable energy. So Kande Yumkella, working with the Secretary General, created an advisory group on energy and climate, brought forward some recommendations. They were well received by the General Assembly, And at the end of 2010, the General Assembly declared 2012 the International Year of Sustainable Energy for All. And the Secretary General, picking up that baton, declared an initiative on sustainable energy for all with 3 objectives for the world to pursue by the year 2030. Number 1, universal access to modern energy services for the 1.3 billion people who don't have any electricity, the 2.7 billion people who are still using wood and charcoal, even animal waste to cook and heat, and who are suffering lung disease because of the pollution that kills 2 million women and children a year. The time has come in this modern society for everybody to have access to modern energy services. So number 1, universal access by 2030. Number 2, double the rate of improvement in energy efficiency. And number 3, double the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. Efficiency and renewables are the cornerstone of a clean energy economy. It's where we have to go if we're going to reduce our emissions. It brings you back to those climate objectives, but it does it through an energy lens that makes economic sense, makes environmental sense to people who want to reduce pollution, clean up the air, clean up their water. And it's what countries like China and India and Brazil and South Africa are undertaking on their own. Come now the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, which begins in a formal sense in about 10 days in Rio. Rio plus 20, as Tim said. The objective is to look back over the last 20 years to the original Rio Conference and ask ourselves, where has the world come? What kind of progress have we been making on sustainable development, and where do we need to go? Now, I think that by some measures, you could get pretty discouraged about that because the world's using much more of its natural resources than it can sustainably consume. The pollution and the climate situation around the world has gotten worse. There are many negative indicators. But at the same time, I think, as Tim said, in 1992, thinking about the global environment was really a new concept. And if you think about where we have come over the last 20 years in the global awareness of the challenge we face and increasing the solutions that are at hand, we've come a long way, and it's an appropriate time for a check-in in Rio in June. The Secretary General, recognizing that the conference itself is a function of the General Assembly and the member states, put down his recommendations on sustainable energy for all and urged all the countries of the world to support them. That may be taken up in the negotiations. We believe it will. We believe that there will be a good outcome in Rio on that point, an endorsement of those objectives. But whether or not that happens, he's also reached out, as Tim said, to governments, to businesses, to NGOs around the world and said, we want you to bring forward your own commitments to action on this topic. He created a high-level group on sustainable energy for all that was co-chaired by Candy Mkela and by Chad Holliday, former CEO of DuPont, now the chairman of Bank of America, really depicting that there's a new way for the UN to do business, in partnership with the private sector, in partnership with civil society, to achieve goals together, because governments alone are not going to be able to do it. Governments are not going to be able to tackle the enormous challenge of changing the world's energy systems, trillions of dollars of investment literally every year in that system. You can't do that with government funding. You have to find ways that the governments can work together with businesses, align their incentives, align their motives, align their outcomes, so that the private sector will be investing in sustainable energy for tomorrow. And we hope that in Rio, in 10 days, we'll start to see some of those announcements come out about what the steps are that governments are going to take, that businesses are going to take, to set the UN on a new trajectory to deliver sustainable energy for all by 2030. Back to you, Tim.
Thank you. We are lucky to have editor of the Yale Daily and then went to work for Senator Danforth and then got recruited by the George H.W. Bush, where he was the lead speechwriter for the first President Bush, and then Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Department of Energy, and then he came in and worked for us. We were lucky to have him. Okay, let's stop with that. That's a lot of material, but this is a massive job. This is a massive job, but only the UN can do it. I mean, there's nobody else has even Exxon. You know, they're going to be part. We hope be a part of this team in various ways. The biggest companies in the world, you know, we hope are joining in, and lots of them are. There are a lot of commitments being made. So let's stop right there and let's open it up for any questions that you may have. We got microphones in the back, I think, so please raise your hands and introduce yourselves. Stand up so everybody can see who you are, and introduce yourselves and then ask a question. Be great.
Michael Goff. I'm with the Nashville, Tennessee chapter. My question is, in the aftermath of the Fukushima disaster last year, and many countries rethinking their nuclear energy policy, how has that affected UN thinking on energy?
I think that in a formal sense, a direct answer to that question, I don't know if you could all hear it, what's the repercussions of Fukushima on the nuclear industry, particularly with regard to the UN? I think the UN has always taken a relatively neutral stance about nuclear energy. The International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna has been a technical resource for that industry. I think that as you look around the world, though, Germany and Japan, which you'd have to say are probably the leading engineering countries in the world, have turned away from nuclear energy. And the future in the developed world, I don't think, is for great growth. There's certainly a lot of nuclear energy being put into China and likely throughout the developing world. I would just say this, though, that the fact that Germany and Japan, in effect, are turning from nuclear energy to renewable energy is significant in two ways. One is that it turns all those engineering minds to continue to innovate, continue to drive down the costs, continue to make that the least cost option for everybody. And it also creates a market. When Germany put solar panels on millions of their homes, it may not have been the right economic thing for them to do in a straight energy sense, but it created hundreds of thousands of new jobs, and it created a market for solar panels that has driven down the cost by 75% over the last 3 years. So as we build that market, as we get these technologies spread throughout the world, and Japan is going to go into renewables in a very, very big way, in a way that it has not before, you're going to see continued progress that we're all going to benefit from in terms of our own consumption of renewable energy.
I'm Albert Sosa from Phoenix, Arizona.
You got a word in the microphone.
Sure, come on up here.
Okay.
Grab the microphone. There you go.
I'm Albert Salosa from Phoenix, Arizona. One of the issues that might be critical, and if you can explain this to us, is population growth. As population increases, of course, our corporations encourage more consumption. So how do we really tally this, or with sustainability?
Good for you. This is the elephant, in my view, the elephant in the room. We are about the only remaining advocate persistently to focus on the population issue. Ted Turner believes that absolutely. Our board has given us absolutely. I can't get outside of the interest of our board in this. So we're doing everything we possibly can. But it is an issue that if climate change is complicated politically, population is complicated times 5 for a whole variety of reasons. 20 years ago, we're about to come up to the 20 years of Cairo Plus 20, the big international conference on Cairo. I chaired the U.S. delegation there 20 years ago. It was a huge success. It was an enormous change in the way in which we thought about women in politics, empowering women to make decisions for themselves, about the size of their families, the spacing of their children. It was a real shuddering shift. And since then, there has been a massive counterattack from the right, particularly led by the Catholic Church, all over the world, and especially in Africa, coming back at us fiercely. Why is that? Well, this is basically a political issue. And there's only so much political power in the world. That was shifted from men to women. And the men are reacting, and that's what we're seeing. It's a pretty raw phenomenon. The metrics of this are very interesting. There are about 215 million women in the world who want to have family planning services and can't get them. At the time of Cairo 20 years ago, that number was 130 million. So despite all of the efforts and the investment that have been made, and the U.S. is the lead investor in this, despite all of the investments that have been made, the unmet need has gone from 130 million to 215 million, and we're going to 250 pretty rapidly, because in the world today, entering their childbearing years is the largest cadre of people in world history. 3 million people. This is a very young global population. 3 billion people are entering their childbearing years. We're at 7 billion people now, and how these 3 billion people are treated, how that choices that they have about their own lives, and how governments deal with that is going to determine if the world goes to 8.5, 10, or even 12 billion people. So it's a critical area right now. And we are deeply engaged in that at the UN Foundation. We are the lead group with a number of other foundations. We've recruited to this to work the Hill. Peter Yo is leading this effort, and we are doing everything we can to get the Congress to increase funding. This administration's been very good about it. We've moved up, not fast enough, but we've moved up, and in the spending from the U.S. And just recently, the Gates Foundation and the British government agreed that they are going to have a major meeting in July in London, in which they're going to try to recruit other funding, because they too recognize this crucial time. It's what is this large bulge? How are these people entering their childbearing years going to, deal with the questions that they have? So it's the most important issue, in my opinion. Nobody wants to talk about it because it's very sensitive, very hard to do. It used to be Eisenhower was the person that started family planning in this country. It was something that was, when George H.W. Bush came to town as a freshman member of the Congress, the first thing that he did was to start the first population caucus in the House of Representatives. He was affectionately known as Rubbers Bush at that time. Anyway, anyway, it was imagine how this has changed in the last 30 years, and we've got to do everything we can, and I'm really glad you brought up, got to keep putting this out there and putting it out there and putting it out there. Keep working on it.
I would just add that, as you think about sustainability, think about it as an equation of population times consumption. And adding population in the United States has a hugely bigger impact on consumption than if you add in a developing country. And so we have to think about both of those pieces together. But a very interesting study done by Brian O'Neill out in Colorado showed that if you could deliver the family planning services to the women who want them but can't get them, that'd be the cheapest carbon reduction you could buy.
Final note that we don't realize is that the United States has the fastest growing population exclusive of immigration, the fastest growing population of any industrialized country in the world, and 50% of the births in the United States are unplanned or unwanted. 50%. This isn't that they're not going to have those children, but when are they going to have them and so on. So we're not doing so well ourselves in terms of providing women and families with the services and information that they need. So,
in the panel that preceded, we talked about how the U.S. had.
Where are we? We're right here. Okay, yeah.
Sorry. we talked about how the U.S. had played such a positive role on the Human Rights Council in advancing such issues as LGBT rights, women's rights, religious freedom and speech. And I wonder, is there a dynamic tension that we face in bringing those values forward? Is there a cultural presumption or a presumption in terms of overriding individual nations' autonomy? Is there a dynamic tension, or are there certain issues that simply are basic issues of human rights that we need to advance?
Well, there's a defense, a very interesting question, and there is a defense that's raised by a number of countries saying it's contrary to our cultural norms to empower women. It's contrary to our cultural norms to let families make these these are male decisions. I mean, that sort of thing. But I think, and you know, Felice probably talked about this morning, you know, there are universal values that relate to, you know, at least very much part of what the UN's all about, relate to empowering individuals and creating a society of mutual respect for all people. And that's what the basic, you know, human rights statement, Eleanor Roosevelt's basic prose, is all about. And that goes, you know, across cultural lines, and it goes across geographic lines, and it's something that, you know, I think is at the core of the UN. But it's a good question because it's raised on something of a steady basis, particularly by those who are resisting this kind of pressure, not pressure, but resisting the norms that the UN is, at its best, advocating. Please, let's come over here. Who's got the microphone? Over here. Why don't you let people hold on to it themselves, and then they can deal with it. Go ahead.
Hello, Ginger Stillman. Please excuse my not standing. The Southern New York State Division is working on an energy project, has a blog, has many ambitions, has been starting to have some programming. And we are also going to be blogging and tweeting and Facebooking next Tuesday for Rio Plus Social. What I'd like to ask the gentleman is, what do you think the role of UNA could be in the next week or so with Rio and going forward in the energy area? Because I think that many of us would like to be very helpful.
Aaron Sherinian, whom many, it's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked it. Aaron Sherinian, whom many of you have gotten to know, sort of our blazing guy of creatively thinking about all of the social media and how we engage people. One of our fundamental missions at the UN Foundation, in cooperation with UNA, and one of the really great parts of this alliance, is to engage more and more people to be thinking about, you know, what role they can play as individuals, how they can do things, whether they buy a bed net or whether they're sending a note to their congressman or how they're operating in their communities. There are all kinds of ways for people to get involved. So Aaron will have up a website on, I think it's up now, on Rio Plus 20, and that's filled with all kinds of ideas and information. So I don't want to steal Aaron's thunder, and I can't tell you exactly what's there, but there are, you know, a whole variety of opportunities there. He is also going to be running sort of a very significant operation in Rio with the blogosphere. He might have talked to you about that already today. It's really interesting to see him doing this and to see our friends at the UN really embracing the social media. You know, it's just wonderful. You know, I find it difficult catching on. Imagine if you're a mid-level bureaucrat who's been at the UN for 30 years and Aaron comes bopping in and telling you about all this stuff. You know, it's wonderful, and they love it. You know, so I think we're making some progress.
There's the UN is trying to be inclusive as well, and there's a place on the Rio Plus 20 websites called the Rio Plus 20 Dialogues, where you can engage in conversation and actually vote on various priorities in 10 different areas. And then you can either, because you're deeply familiar with the rock band Linkin Park, or because you want to brag to your kids, go to their website, powertheworld.org, and sign up and show your support for the Secretary General.
Hi, I'm Margaret Corbin from Rochester, New York. I wanted to get back to the energy issue, and like many other things, we get to this sort of 1-10 idea. We're either going to do keep things as they are, or we're going to switch over to you know, all renewables. And the nuclear energy issue doesn't get too far in conversations very often. There's a good model at the Idaho National Labs where they bring together the government the industry and education to make the development, and I don't hear too much about that, but I know they're here. They come and talk to the federal government, but we don't read much about that and how nuclear energy it can be used, but among many things. I think it's like we have to choose, and I think it would be helpful to encourage that we need to do everything.
I think as a general proposition, I think we have to do everything. You know, we're in a real crisis situation on climate change. The climate's changing much faster. Temperatures are going up much more. There's more carbon in the atmosphere. All the indicators are very dangerous, very alarming. And so we have to look at all of the possible alternatives, of which nuclear is one, obviously, because it is the cleanest if you can make it work safely and economically. You know, that becomes, I think, the biggest barrier. I did this for 30 years in the Congress, and it's the economic barrier I always thought was the one that was going to be the stone wall for nuclear, because it's just so much more expensive. Now with the arrival of all of the new opportunities for fracturing with shale gas and oil deposits, which are occurring not only in the United States, but all over the world. China may have even greater deposits than we do. You know, I think and that's so much more cheaper than nuclear. I think we're going to find that. Hear anything about? Well, that may be down the line, but we're in a situation now. We're at a crisis time right now. And, you know, a nuclear power plant takes 10 or 15 years to build. It's very, very expensive to do. Fusion's been on the horizon for a long time. Everybody, I can remember talking about fusion when I first came to the Congress 40 years ago. And, you know, we were all hopeful that that was going to occur. Maybe it will, and we got to keep working on it. But right now, you know, we're at a point looking at that carbon curve, and we got to work on that carbon curve with a real sense of urgency. And engendering that in this government is very hard.
I think I'd just make one additional comment to that, that we're at a moment in the evolution of the energy systems away from kind of a mainframe model to a networked model. And just as the mainframes ended up having a relatively limited role in the computer universe, and networked small computers ended up being more powerful and more effective, I think that we're going to see energy systems becoming much more dispersed, networked together, and not relying so much on large central station generation.
Hi, I'm over here. Hello, Caitlin Hassler from the Greater Boston chapter, and I want to continue the conversation, I guess, about how UNA can engage on issues of energy and environmental sustainability. And this is a conversation that we've definitely had in our chapter, and particularly I was glad that you spoke about the reaching out to businesses and corporations, because that's definitely an area where this is where the conversation and the movement needs to happen. And so one way that we've been looking at this in the Boston area is looking at the UN Global Compact and the principles for responsible investment, and who in Massachusetts, what companies in Massachusetts are signatories of those principles and the UN Global Compact, and actually working with the UN Global Compact office to invite those company members then to our annual event, our UN Day luncheon, to recognize them for being signatories, and hopefully then using our small position, I guess, as a grassroots organization to elevate both the work of those companies and to encourage perhaps the other companies and business leaders in our area to consider signing on to the principles or the UN Global Compact as well. And so I guess looking at it from that framework, are there additional ways or other ways that we as association chapters can partner on a grassroots level with UNF, with the UN, to really move the businesses and engage the businesses and corporations in our communities?
Well, it's a very good point too. I think that if you again thinking about the sweep of things, there's so much more power today in corporate hands than there was even 20 years ago, and These are increasingly multinational corporations. And what's interesting about the relationship with the Global Compact is that they now think about partnering with the UN as their global partner, as opposed to thinking about it. Tim reminds me to refresh your memory about the UN Global Compact. The Global Compact literally is 10 principles of good corporate behavior. And more than 6,000 companies have signed up to that and become part of a network that's been rapidly growing over the last several years and that aspires to reach 20,000 companies around the world. They are a big part of Rio Plus 20. They're a partner with us on sustainable energy for all. This does speak to the new relationship between the UN and the private sector of partnership in that regard. But coming from Boston, I have to give Ceres a shout out. It's an NGO up there that we've worked with on 5 successful institutional investor summits that we've held at the UN to bring the business and finance community in to talk about how the world is changing on energy and climate and how their investments ought to change as a result. Now, you've been favoring your right wing, Tim, so I think we need to go over here.
Trying to change, Reed.
Back to the moderate middle here.
Well, finally he got here. Yes, Carl Mars, Orange County Chapter, California. I've got a question, I guess, basically for Reed. I think, as you know, and I know because I worked in the field for quite a while, that if you look at the cost of power generated from fossil fuels, especially with coal, where you're not looking to take out mercury and some of the other difficult pollutants to take out, you're never going to compete with renewables in the marketplace unless you look at carbon sequestration. If you get 2 ways of doing that, one is a carbon tax, which people have frowned on, but the other one that seemed to be quite popular with Republicans even was cap and trade. Now you need to put a value on carbon at some point in order to make renewables competitive, I think in the near term. Otherwise, we're going to put so much CO2 in the atmosphere by the time we decide what we can charge for a carbon tax or whatever, it's too late. But anyway, my question is, why can't we arrive at a reasonable level and adopt one or the other so we can move faster to renewables and make them economical?
I think that the direct answer to that is that the political stalemate in Washington has focused in on cost versus benefit. And if all you think about is cost, why do it? If you think about the environmental benefit, of course you would do it. But if you don't accept that the environmental benefit matters, then you're not going to do that. But I can't allow you to address me about cap and trade when this guy passed the original cap and trade in the Senate.
Well, it's interesting. What has to be done is the president simply has to raise the issue of climate change. It's not going to happen because people want to think about climate change. They don't want to think about climate change. None of us, you know, you just don't. It's not human nature. You know, it's an unpresent, threatening kind of an idea. You know, you're not going to go out and get out of bed first thing in the morning and say, you know, I'm really going to think about climate change today because I want to get really depressed. You're not going to do that. You know, and you're not going to say, I want to change my economic pattern of life unless we're all talking about it together. And, you know, the president gave it a shot in the first 2 years. It has disappeared entirely. You can't find on the White House website now any mention of climate change. You can't find in Mitt Romney's website any mention of climate change. And, you know, that is an astonishing, it seems to me, commentary. But it's politics. Okay, we're going to get to November, and it's what happens after November. Then it seems to me, you know, the Bostons and the Tucsons and all of us got to be saying, okay, now let's get serious about dealing with climate change, and you can't deal with climate change unless you deal with price. We can't allow the fossil fuel companies to continue to use the atmosphere as a garbage dump. You know, if I dump my garbage out in the street, you know, it's going to attract rats. I'm going to get a fine. I'm going to pay for it. We don't do that anymore. We used to throw it out the second floor, right? Out into the middle of the street. We don't do that anymore. We all pay for it now. And we're going to have to pay for the garbage that we're putting up in the atmosphere. And that may be in part one of the ways in which we explain this to people. You know, that this is, the president has tried to do it through cap and trade, and I think they did it badly. I don't think they did that right. They tried to do it through green jobs, and that one kind of busted. We're going to have to figure out some new way to put this into the debate and the discussion after November. We understand politics, but assuming Obama gets reelected, you know, he's got 4 years of a clear shot at it. And, you know, I don't know what Romney might do. His economics people, his two Greg Menkiw and the guy who used to head of CBO, have both talked about, you know, the need to reform the tax code. And one of the ways to reform the tax code is to think about getting revenues from carbon in there. So those are hopeful signs in the galaxy of thinking around the Romney people. So it's not all dead yet. We got to keep pushing it.
From Tampa Bay chapter. Tim, you might remember me from the Hunter Creek, Sally Rainey, John Denver, Licking County Commissioner days. Tim was a champion for us to get the Endangered American Wilderness Act, so I'll always be thankful for you for that, Tim. I was a leader of, one of 6 leaders of the Global Environment Team at the Earth Summit in Rio in '92. We had 150 people. We were the only civil society group to actually gain access into the unsaid part of the meeting for protest. Our group was composed primarily of people of faith, educators, and UNA members from around the world. 3 things that I wanted to comment that we think came out of there besides the ones that you had mentioned. The Rio Declaration, which became the basis for ethics for Agenda 21, later affirmed in Johannesburg. The major stakeholder group, giving civil society an opportunity to participate with UNEP deliberations for some time. Over the years in working on sustainability issues, I have become convinced that one of the opportunities is tourism. About 10.5% of the world's GDP is tourism. 11.5 to 12.5% of the world's workforce is tourism. You have a wonderful program in the UN Foundation, the Global Sustainable Tourism Council. Can you comment on ways that that group can better interface with UNA to help empower this to do that? And the last comment I want to make is our mutual friend and colleague Amory Lovins has a new book, Reinventing Fire, which gives a blueprint on how to get off all imported fossil fuels, to do it without a lot of new legislation, and to pump $5.7 trillion into the economy. And I think the UN Foundation ought to be really looking at that seriously as a way to promote that as a model. Thank you.
I'll touch on that last one just because there was an item in the paper just this weekend of a British designer who'd come up with a car that looks like one of those smart cars, like it's chopped off halfway, right? But it goes 90 miles an hour, and it does it on electricity and $1.06 a gallon equivalent. So the reason he's doing it is because he's using Amory Lovins carbon fiber composites around the outside of the car. So some of this is happening the way Amory's saying it's going to happen, which is led by business.
Yeah, we'll do this and then one more question, then we got a break. We gave it a shot related to tourism because it was the largest industry in the world. It is the largest industry in the world in terms of money that goes through it and numbers of employees. It's just huge. But it is also incredibly decentralized. So you've got to get at it in a lot of different ways. And we tried to do it through some groups like some of the online travel groups, and some of that was successful. We got that going. We tried to do it through a number of publications like Condé Nast, and we got that going, and we tried to do it through UNESCO, which had the responsibility in the UN system. All very difficult to do. I remember being in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and I was having dinner with the head of the largest hotel chain. And I was hammering on him about their responsibilities on sustainability and tourism and so on. And he looked at me and he said, "That's not my job. That's the mayor of the town in which our hotel is." I said, sort of an illustration of where the job. So it's a bit, that, what do you say? Yes, it is your job. Well, it is his job. And I just would suspect that if we had that conversation today, because of the efforts that we're seeing everywhere, the private sector would be more involved, and he's probably thinking about what his hotels do. He's got an awful lot of them around the world. So it's a gradual effort. We're making some progress on the tourism side of things, just chipping away at it and chipping away at it, and it's so big, it really is. It's been interesting to try. It's not been one of our signal successes so far, I would say.
Just to give a shout out to one of our partners, Mike Finley, who runs the Turner Foundation, has been a real leader in this domestically, working with the National Restaurant Association and more recently with the Hotel Association, and has really brought about very substantial change in their energy consumption and their seafood acquisition, et cetera. So there are ways to make progress on this, but it's a tough slog.
We're going to go to the great Elmendorf for a last question.
Thanks, Tim. Ed Elmendorf from National Capital Area. I wanted to go back to the climate change energy dynamic and the dynamics of decision-making at the UN on these issues. You talked about the importance of the UN, civil society, and private business, the private sector, as being the heart of it all. But if we're going to have a worldwide consensus on these issues, we've got to bring the small countries along, and they seem very frequently to be ignored. I hear echoes of resistance there. And what do you think can be done about that set of problems? Thanks.
Well, let me go
I think
first,
of all of
Tim.
you know Ed Elmendorf held together UNA very, very well, and we're all very indebted to you, Ed. Thank you very much for years of very good activity on that front. This is, Ed asked a very sensitive and a really interesting question that if I were doing a PhD dissertation in political science, one of the things that I would look at is the dynamics of small countries and how they can get together and use their collective power to stop things. They can't get much done, but they can stop things. And what we're watching now are a couple of things. I think all of you who are watchers of the UN know that the UN has sort of originally split itself into a group called the G77, the developing countries. There it's now should be the G146 or something like that. But it's the G77 plus China, China being a small developing country, right? But it's the G77 plus China. It's a legitimate group for historic reasons. We all see historic things that happen, and you know the world's changing, but that's convenient for people to have. So how do you appeal to the G77, right? If you really want to get a developing world perspective, you go to the G77 and you say the developed world is taking you to the cleaners, and what you got to do is to stop everything unless they give us more money to do X, Y, or Z. I mean, basically, that's hold them up. We're not going to make any decisions. That's pretty raw, but in fact it occurs. Then there are more subtle ways of doing that. Like we see them now, there's an alliance around the energy thing, which is the energy initiatives that Reed was talking about, which is Bolivia, Cuba, Venezuela, and somebody else, I've forgotten. Not a friendly foursome. And what they're trying to do is to submarine, as far as I can see, I'd say they're doing pretty effectively to submarine these negotiations, because it looks like it's Uncle Sam that's really pushing the energy thing, or it's an Uncle Sam dominated Secretary General who's doing it, or whatever the ideological lens through which they view this, they are doing that, and they've put some very good diplomats on this. Other people don't have the expertise, so they tend to carry the day on a lot of these questions, as you know. A third way of doing it is to get somebody out there who has a lot of money who wants to give assistance to countries. And that's where I think our friends in Saudi Arabia come in. Now, the Saudis haven't been particularly friendly in the past to issues of sustainability and issues of I'm doing all the things that are politically incorrect here, but I mean, we all got to talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about this sort of shh. But in fact, it's the case. You know, they've not been particularly friendly to issues of solar and non-fossil fuels, right? So they have resisted this, and the U.S. and the Saudis, as Reed suggested, have historically been in alliance at the UN to stop any discussion of energy. That's our sandbox. Stay out of it. Right? And they've done that very effectively, and the Saudis were, throughout these negotiations, very closely tied with some very large industries, and they've put real effort into stopping a lot of this. I give great credit to the Secretary General for having taken this on. He has shamelessly, without any hesitation, taken this on. And he just sent Bob Orr to Saudi Arabia, as his emissary, saying, we're going to be serious about this. Please engage with us. Please get involved. Been very positive about it. And I think the Saudis are beginning to move around. You watch some of the Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates, for example, have got the International Center for Sustainable Energy, for Renewable Energy, is in Abu Dhabi, of all places. I mean, you'd say, what? That's sort of inconsistent, but they're looking way down the line, that small but I think very enlightened country looking way down the line. So I suspect that has some impact on their colleagues. So there are lots of ways of stopping it from happening. And the UN is, as you all know, something of an opaque institution. You don't always know who's saying what and who's on the level and what they're saying and what's happening. So you kind of got to dig around, and Ed's smiling because he knows that that's the case. You got to figure out where it's coming from and, how do you try to get around those particular blockages. It takes, like anything else, it takes a lot of persistence. Reed has been our leader on all of this energy activity, and I give him and his colleagues, and there are a few people that have really driven this major, I think it's going to be a major commitment, if not the most important thing coming out of Rio +20. I think a number of developing countries, 50 or 60 developing countries, have now signed on. Contrary to the sort of flow of business going the other way, historically, they have said, we want to get involved in this. So that's kind of breaking this old way of thinking and old way of doing business. So again, we're making progress slowly but surely. You got to keep pushing, you got to keep pushing, and they're out there pushing the other way, but we hope their push is a little softer than it used to be. Is that right? But it's really interesting, the politics of all of it. It is fundamentally, the UN is fundamentally a political institution, so you got to figure out who's coming from where and why are they coming from where they are.